June 4th, 1942. The sun rose over the Pacific Ocean like a blood-red warning, casting its glow across a vast armada of Japanese warships cutting through dark waters toward a tiny atoll called Midway. Aboard the carrier Akagi, Vice Admiral Nagumo Kiichi stood on the bridge, his jaw set firm as steel, watching his pilots prepare their aircraft for what he believed would be another crushing victory. The same carriers that had devastated Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier now sailed with the confidence of conquerors, their crews convinced that American naval power lay broken and defeated. Japan's empire stretched across the Pacific like an iron fist, and Midway would be the final blow that would force the United States to negotiate peace on Tokyo's terms. But in the holds of those magnificent carriers, beneath the proud rising sun flags snapping in the ocean breeze, destruction was already being loaded into the bomb bays of aircraft destruction that would soon turn inward upon itself. The architects of Japan's Pacific strategy had crafted their Midway operation with meticulous care. Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, the brilliant tactician who had orchestrated Pearl Harbor, commanded the overall operation from his flagship Yamato, the largest battleship ever constructed. His plan was elegant in its complexity: feint toward Alaska's Aleutian Islands to draw American forces north, then strike Midway with overwhelming force, destroying whatever remained of the United States Pacific Fleet when it rushed to defend the strategic atoll. For fleet carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiru formed the striking force, carrying over 250 aircraft and protected by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. This was the Kido Butai, the Pearl Harbor Strike Force, undefeated and seemingly invincible, according to detailed accounts preserved in the Naval History and Heritage Command archives. Japanese confidence stemmed from an unbroken string of victories that had stunned the world. In 6 months of warfare, Japan's forces had conquered the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, and Burma. British battleships had been sunk, American garrisons overwhelmed, and European colonial empires humiliated. The Japanese military leadership believed their warrior spirit and tactical superiority made them unstoppable. They had studied American culture and found it soft, individualistic, lacking the collective discipline and willingness to sacrifice that defined the Japanese armed forces. Midway would prove these assumptions catastrophically wrong. The air crews preparing for launch that morning embodied this confidence. These were elite pilots, many veterans of Pearl Harbor and the subsequent campaigns. They had trained for years, honing their skills to razor sharpness. Flight Petty Officer Nishikuchi briefed his squadron aboard Hiryu, reviewing the attack plan one final time. First, they would neutralize Midway's defenses, destroying the American aircraft and installations on the atoll. Then, when the American carriers inevitably appeared, they would annihilate them just as they had destroyed the battleships at Pearl Harbor. It seemed simple, inevitable, destined, but what the Japanese did not know, what they could not have known, was that American codebreakers had shattered their naval cipher. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team of cryptanalysts at Station Hypo in Hawaii had performed a miracle of intelligence work, decrypting enough Japanese messages to reveal not just that an attack was coming, but where and when. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, knew the Japanese plan better than some of Yamamoto's own subordinate commanders. He positioned his 3 available carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, northeast of Midway, waiting in ambush. The hunters had become the hunted, though they sailed forward unaware, confident in their strength and their destiny, toward the most decisive naval battle in history, the first American. Aircraft appeared over the Japanese fleet at approximately 6:30 in the morning. Torpedo bombers from Midway Atoll itself, flying obsolete, Douglas Devastators, and even more ancient, Vindicators that the pilots grimly called wind indicators because of their slow speed. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led Torpedo Squadron 8 from the carrier Hornet into the teeth of Japanese defenses, his 15 aircraft facing a wall of anti-aircraft fire and swarms of Zero fighters. The Zeros, piloted by Japan's finest aviators, tore into the American formations with devastating efficiency. One by one, the torpedo bombers fell, burning into the sea. Of Waldron's entire squadron, only Ensign George Gay survived, floating in the water among the wreckage, watching the battle unfold from his precarious position. Aboard the Japanese carriers, the seemingly effortless destruction of wave after wave of American attackers reinforced the crew's confidence. The Americans were brave suicidally so, but their outdated tactics and inferior aircraft appeared to pose no real threat. Vice Admiral Nagumo watched the defensive battle with satisfaction, certain that American desperation proved Japanese superiority. His carriers had launched their first strike against Midway at 4:30 that morning, and now those aircraft were returning. Their pilots reporting successful attacks, but recommending a second strike to fully neutralize the island's defenses. Nagumo faced a commander's nightmare, a decision with imperfect information, no time to deliberate. His aircraft carrier's hangars currently held aircraft armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, weapons configured for attacking ships. If American carriers were nearby, these were the correct weapons. But if Midway required another strike, he needed fragmentation, bombs, and incendiary weapons for land targets. At 7:15, Nagumo made his fateful decision: rearm the aircraft for a second Midway strike. Crews frantically began removing torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs from aircraft, a process requiring them to be temporarily stacked on the hangar decks. While the correct weapons were retrieved from the magazines below, then at 7:28, the scout plane from the cruiser Tone, launched late due to catapult problems, radioed the message that changed everything. Sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships. Akoma demanded clarification. Did the American force include carriers? The scout pilot, flying at high altitude in broken clouds, couldn't tell. Nagumo hesitated, caught between two imperatives. Minutes stretched like hours as he waited for confirmation while his air crews continued rearming aircraft. The hangar decks now crowded with bombs, torpedoes, and fuel lines in chaotic disarray. At 8:09, the scout finally confirmed the enemy is accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. Nagumo immediately ordered the rearming process reversed. Now the crews had to remove the land attack weapons. They had just loaded and reinstalled the anti-ship torpedoes they had just removed. The process would take over an hour, and the weapons removed from aircraft were simply pushed aside on the hangar decks, creating a deadly accumulation of ordnance. Standard Japanese carrier doctrine called for stowing weapons in the armored magazines between strikes. But there was no time now. Everything sat exposed and vulnerable. Live bombs and torpedoes surrounded by fuel lines and ammunition. Meanwhile, more American attacks pressed home. Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown swept in at 9:10, then Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise. The Japanese combat air patrol and anti-aircraft fire destroyed them with the same ruthless efficiency, shooting down 35 of 41 torpedo bombers. The Americans had launched their attacks piecemeal, uncoordinated, allowing the Japanese to defeat them sequentially. Not a single American torpedo had struck home. To the Japanese sailors and airmen, it seemed like another day of American futility and Japanese triumph. But those doomed torpedo attacks had inadvertently accomplished something crucial. They had drawn the Japanese fighter cover down to sea level, chasing the low-flying torpedo bombers, leaving the high-altitude approaches unguarded. And the American dive bombers were only minutes away, at 10:122 on June 4th. 1942, Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's dive bomber group, spotted the Japanese fleet. He had been airborne for more than 2 hours, his fuel gauges dropping toward empty, searching the vast Pacific for an enemy that intelligence promised was there. He had flown past where the Japanese should have been, found nothing but empty ocean, and made a calculated gamble. He turned northwest, following the wake of a lone Japanese destroyer racing to rejoin the main fleet. Now, 33 Douglas Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and 17 more from Yorktown having arrived by sheer coincidence at the same moment, perched at 14,000 feet above 3 Japanese carriers steaming in formation: Kaga, Akagi, and Soryu. Below them, the carriers' decks were crowded with aircraft being refueled and rearmed. fuel lines snaking across the wooden planking, and the Japanese combat air patrol was down at sea level. Still engaged with the last of the torpedo bombers, McCluskey rolled into his dive, and 32 aircraft followed him down. The dauntless dive bombers plummeted at a 70-degree angle, winds screaming past their wings, accelerating past 250 miles per hour. Japanese lookouts barely had time to shout warnings before the first bombs began to fall. On Kaga, Lieutenant Best's group from Enterprise screamed down through minimal anti-aircraft fire. At 1,500 feet, Best released his 1,000-pound bomb and pulled out of his dive so hard that he strained against his harness. He didn't see his bomb hit, but behind him. 2 more Dauntlesses put their bombs directly onto Kaga's flight deck. The first bomb penetrated near the forward elevator, detonating in the upper hangar deck precisely where the hastily rearmed aircraft sat surrounded by fuel, torpedoes, and bombs. The explosion touched off a catastrophic chain reaction. Torpedoes detonated, aviation fuel ignited, and secondary explosions ripped through the hangar like a dying dragon's breath. Within seconds, Kaga transformed from a mighty warship into a floating holocaust. Pilots strapped into their cockpits, waiting to launch, burned alive. Damage control parties rushing to fight fires were incinerated by follow-on explosions. The carrier's captain, Jisaku Okada, stood on his bridge, watching helplessly as his ship died beneath him. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Richard Best led Enterprise's bombing Squadron 6 against Akagi Nagumo's flagship. Best's wingmen attacked Kaga by mistake, leaving Best alone to assault the fleet's most important carrier. He pushed over into his dive at precisely 10-20-6, aiming for the rising sun painted on Akagi's forward deck. His bomb struck just behind the midship elevator, penetrating to the hangar deck, where the reversed rearming had left ordnance scattered everywhere. The explosion ignited fully fueled aircraft and set off stacked bombs and torpedoes. Fires spread instantly through the hangar, and flames erupted from the elevator wells onto the flight deck. Nagumo, standing on the bridge, felt the deck shudder beneath his feet. Staff officers urged him to transfer his flag to another ship, but he stood frozen, watching his beautiful flagship consumed by flames. Unable to process the sudden reversal of fortune, Yorktown's dive bombers, arriving seconds later, targeted Soryu. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's squadron put 3 bombs into the carrier within minutes. As recorded in action reports preserved at the National Archives, 1 bomb hit near the forward elevator, another amidships, and a third aft, starting fires that merged into a single inferno. Soryu's captain, Ryusaku Yanagimoto, knew within minutes that his ship was doomed. The carrier's fire mains had been destroyed, making firefighting impossible. Aviation fuel spread across the hangar decks, and the heat grew so intense that ammunition began cooking off. Yanagimoto ordered his crew to abandon ship, but he chose to remain aboard, lashing himself to the anchor windlass. Determined to go down with his vessel, in 3 minutes, from 10:22 to 10-20-53. Japanese fleet carriers had been mortally wounded. The precise instrument that had struck Pearl Harbor and ravaged the Pacific for 6 months was broken beyond repair. But the battle was not over. 1 Japanese carrier remained, Hiryu, sailing beyond the visual range of the other 3, had escaped the American dive bombers' attention. Her captain Tomio Kaku and her air group commander, Joichi Tominaga, were already launching a counterattack. Determined to avenge their sister ships and salvage victory from catastrophiating, Nakajima Baffivan torpedo bombers and 6-0 fighters launched from Hiryu's deck at 10:40. The last offensive blow Japan's mobile force could deliver? Leading the attack was Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, one of Japan's most skilled and experienced naval aviators, a veteran of Pearl Harbor and every major carrier operation since. His aircraft had been damaged during the morning strike on Midway, a fuel tank punctured by anti-aircraft fire, but he insisted on leading this crucial attack, despite knowing he lacked the fuel to return. His determination exemplified the Japanese warrior ethic that prioritized duty above survival. But it also revealed the desperation now gripping the Japanese fleet. At noon, Tominaga's strike force found the American carrier Yorktown, steaming alone after separating from Enterprise and Hornet, Yorktown's radar detected the incoming aircraft at 46 miles, giving her combat air patrol time to intercept. Wildcats from Fighting Squadron 3 tore into the Japanese formation, shooting down 10 of the torpedo bombers before they could begin their attack runs. But 8 bombers broke through the fighter screen and pressed their attacks with the same suicidal determination their American counterparts had shown that morning. Yorktown's crew, watching the attackers come on despite murderous anti-aircraft fire, understood they faced men who would not turn back. 3 torpedoes struck Yorktown's port side within minutes. The carrier, already damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea the previous month and hastily repaired at Pearl Harbor in just 3 days, shuddered under the impacts. The explosions opened her hull below the waterline, flooding boiler rooms and knocking out power. The ship took on a 17-degree list and slowed to a halt, dead in the water. Her captain, Elliot Buckmaster, ordered the crew to counterflooding to correct the list while damage control parties fought to restore power. For a time it appeared Yorktown might survive. Tominaga, his fuel exhausted, had crashed into the sea miles short of the Japanese fleet. His sacrifice, buying nothing but a temporarily disabled American carrier. But Hiryu was not finished. At 1:30 in the afternoon, Captain Kaku launched a second strike. 10 IHED-3A dive bombers escorted by 6 Zeros. Every aircraft Hiryu had left that could fly. This attack force was led by Lieutenant Joichi Hashimoto, and they found Yorktown at 2:45. By this time, Yorktown's damage control parties had performed near miraculous work. They had restored power, corrected the list, and brought the ship to 20 knots. American fighters from Enterprise and Hornet, now providing combat air patrol over the damaged carrier, intercepted the Japanese dive bombers, but 4 broke through. They mistook Yorktown for an undamaged carrier, not recognizing her as the same ship torpedoed earlier. Leading Japanese commanders to believe they had struck 2 American carriers, the dive bombers scored 3 hits on Yorktown, their bombs penetrating deep into the ship. 1 bomb struck near the number 1 smokestack, destroying the uptakes and snuffing the fires in 5 boilers. Another exploded in the forward elevator well, blowing the 2-ton elevator platform hundreds of feet into the air. The 3rd bomb penetrated to the 4th deck, igniting fires that threatened the forward magazines. This time, Yorktown could not recover. The fires spread beyond control. The list increased to 26 degrees. Captain Buckmaster reluctantly gave the order to abandon ship. 2,600 officers and men went over the side into the Pacific, rescued by escorting destroyers. Yorktown remained afloat but helpless, her survival uncertain. Meanwhile, American search planes had finally located Hiryu. At 3:30 in the afternoon, 24 dive bombers from Enterprise launched to attack the last operational Japanese carrier. Lieutenant Earl Gallagher led the strike, arriving over the Japanese fleet at 5. Hiryu's combat air patrol had been drawn out of position by false radar contacts. Some historians suggest these were flocks of albatross into only 5. Zeros remained overhead when the Dauntlesses attacked. Gallagher's first bomb hit near the forward elevator, and 3 more bombs followed in quick succession, all concentrated in a small area. The explosions ignited Hiryu's hangar, where aircraft were being refueled and rearmed, creating the same catastrophic fires that had destroyed the other carriers. By evening, Hiryu was a blazing wreck, her crew abandoning ship as flames consumed her from within. Japan's carrier striking force, the weapon that had terrorized the Pacific, had been annihilated in a single day. As darkness fell on June 4, 1942, Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku sat in his cabin aboard the super battleship Yamato, 300 miles northwest of the carnage, attempting to salvage something from the catastrophe. Reports reaching him painted an incomprehensible picture. All 4 fleet carriers burning or sunk. Hundreds of irreplaceable pilots dead or floating in the Pacific, and the American carriers still operational. The architect of Pearl Harbor, the man who had warned Japan's leaders that they must win decisively within 6 months or face inevitable defeat, now confronted the reality that his 6 months had expired, and the decisive victory had gone to his enemy instead. Yamamoto's immediate instinct was to continue the attack. He ordered his scattered forces to concentrate for a night surface engagement. hoping his battleships and cruisers could destroy the American carriers in darkness, where their superior gunnery and torpedo skills might prevail. He dispatched urgent orders to Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo, commanding the invasion force to press forward and engage. But Admiral Nagumo, transferred to the light cruiser Nagara after Akagi's loss, sent desperate messages describing the true situation. The mobile force had ceased to exist as a fighting entity. Hundreds of aircraft were gone, and the survivors possessed neither the strength nor the organization to continue offensive operations. The invasion of Midway was impossible without carrier air support. Throughout the night, Yamamoto wrestled with reality. His staff officers, trained to view retreat as dishonorable, urged continued attack. But Yamamoto, for all his warrior spirit, possessed a rational strategic mind. At 2:55 in the morning on June 5th, he issued the order: the Midway operation is cancelled. The Japanese fleet would retire westward back toward the home islands, carrying with them the survivors of 4 magnificent aircraft carriers and the shattered remnants of Japan's aura of invincibility. Historical records from Japanese sources, including post-war testimonies compiled by American naval historians, reveal that many officers wept upon receiving this order, understanding intuitively that they had witnessed not merely a tactical defeat, but a strategic turning point. The withdrawal did not conclude the battle's grim accounting. Hiryu, burning throughout the night, despite heroic damage control efforts, was finally scuttled by torpedoes from Japanese destroyers at 9 the morning of June 5th. Her captain, Tomio Kaku, and the commander of Carrier Division 2, Tamon Yamaguchi, chose to go down with the ship, standing on the bridge as destroyers launched torpedoes into Hiryu's hull. Yamaguchi, widely considered one of the Imperial Navy's most brilliant young admirals, had been educated at Princeton and understood America's industrial potential better than most Japanese officers. His death at Midway robbed Japan of one of the few leaders who might have advocated realistic assessments of Japan's deteriorating strategic position. Akagi burned for an entire day before Japanese destroyers finally torpedoed her on the morning of June 5th. Sailors who had served aboard her since her commissioning in 1927 watched her sink beneath the waves, taking with her not just machinery and weapons, but the accumulated traditions, spirit, and pride of the Imperial Navy's carrier force. Kaga and Soryu had already slipped beneath the waves, their deaths slightly faster but no less final. In total, Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, over 290 aircraft, and approximately 3,000 officers and men, including many of the Navy's most experienced carrier aviators, men whose skills had taken a decade to develop and who were functionally irreplaceable. American losses, while significant, were sustainable. Yorktown stubbornly remained afloat through June 5th and 6th, and salvage efforts nearly succeeded in saving her. But the Japanese submarine I-168, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe, penetrated the destroyer screen on June 6th and put 2 torpedoes into the carrier's hull. 1 torpedo also struck the destroyer Hamon, moored alongside Yorktown, providing pumping and power, breaking her in half and killing 80 men. Yorktown finally rolled over and sank on June 7th, taking with her the Battle of Midway's final lives. America had lost 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, 145 aircraft, and 307 men. These were grievous losses, but represented mere fractions of American strength, whereas Japan's losses constituted irreplaceable capital from a limited strategic reserve. The defeated Japanese fleet limped back toward the home islands, maintaining strict radio silence to avoid revealing the extent of the disaster. Aboard his flagship, Admiral Yamamoto enforced extraordinary security measures. Survivors from the 4 carriers were isolated from other fleet personnel, forbidden to discuss what they had witnessed. Letters home were censored or prohibited entirely. When the fleet reached Japan, survivors were dispersed to far-flung assignments, separated from one another to prevent the truth from spreading through the Navy's ranks. The Japanese government and military leadership understood that Midway represented a catastrophic reversal requiring immediate suppression of information to maintain public morale and international perception of Japanese strength. The Japanese public learned nothing of the disaster. Newspapers continued reporting victories, and government radio broadcasts spoke of successful operations against Midway and the Aleutian Islands, where Japanese forces had indeed occupied the islands of Attu and Kiskaminor. Territorial gains trumpeted to distract from the central disaster. Families of men who died at Midway received delayed notifications attributing deaths to illness or accidents, as the true circumstances concealed. Some families would not learn how their sons or husbands actually died until after Japan's surrender more than 3 years later. This information control, while effective domestically, could not change strategic realities or hide the truth from Japanese military planners who understood the implications. Within the Imperial Navy's senior leadership, Midway ignited fierce debates about Japan's strategic direction. Some officers argued for immediate defensive consolidation, using the Empire's current territorial gains to create an impregnable defensive perimeter that America would find too costly to breach. Others advocated continued offensive operations, insisting that Japanese warrior spirit remained superior and that American industrial capacity, though theoretically greater, would be neutralized by distance, logistics, and lack of fighting spirit. Yamamoto, privately harboring deep pessimism about Japan's prospects, pushed for renewed carrier construction and accelerated pilot training programs. But he knew the mathematics were terrible. American shipyards were launching Essex-class carriers and thousands of aircraft, while Japan's industrial capacity struggled to replace what Midway destroyed. The human cost extended far beyond those who died in the battle itself. The captured carrier pilots and crew, elite of Japan's naval aviation, represented 10 years of training, combat experience, and accumulated tactical knowledge. Their loss created a vacuum in Japanese carrier aviation that subsequent training programs could never fill. New pilots rushed through abbreviated training proved adequate for defensive operations but lacked the offensive skills, aggressive spirit, and combat experience that had characterized the Pearl Harbor generation. American pilots, conversely, improved with each battle, their skills honed by combat experience and enhanced by better aircraft as American industry delivered technological improvements at an accelerating pace, as documented in post-war strategic studies by military historians including Samuel Eliot Morison and Gordon Prange. Midway fundamentally altered the Pacific War's trajectory by eliminating Japan's operational flexibility. Before Midway, Japan could threaten offensives in multiple directions simultaneously toward Australia, India, Hawaii, forcing America to defend everywhere and concentrate nowhere. After Midway, Japan possessed sufficient naval strength only for defensive operations, allowing America to choose where and when to attack. The initiative had permanently shifted to the United States, and Japan would never recover it. The psychological impact proved equally significant. Japanese confidence, built on an unbroken string of victories and reinforced by cultural beliefs in Japanese superiority and destiny, had been shattered. Officers who had viewed Americans as soft, individualistic, and lacking fighting spirit now confronted evidence that American forces could fight with determination and skill. The myth of Japanese invincibility, so carefully cultivated and so psychologically important to Japan's war effort, had been exposed as precisely that, a myth. Conversely, American forces gained the confidence that comes from defeating a previously dominant enemy. The U.S. Navy's personnel, from Admiral Nimitz to the youngest seaman, now knew they could meet Japan's best and win. The months following, Midway witnessed a fundamental transformation in the Pacific War's character. Japan's strategic planning shifted from offensive expansion to defensive consolidation, attempting to create fortified positions throughout its newly conquered empire that would make American reconquest prohibitively expensive. Construction battalions built airfields, fortifications, and supply dumps across the Central and Southwest Pacific, while the Imperial Navy positioned its remaining strength to intercept American offensives wherever they might come. But this defensive strategy contained fatal flaws. Japan's perimeter stretched across millions of square miles of ocean, making it impossible to fortify every position adequately. While American forces could concentrate overwhelming strength against selected targets, achieving local superiority despite overall Japanese territorial advantages. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet from his headquarters in Hawaii, immediately recognized Midway's strategic implications. The victory had not only eliminated the Japanese carrier threat, but it also secured Hawaii's forward defenses and freed American forces for offensive operations. In August 1942, just 2 months after Midway, American forces invaded Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, initiating a grinding 6-month campaign that would further deplete Japanese naval and air strength. The Japanese Navy, still reeling from Midway's losses, committed its remaining carriers to support Guadalcanal operations, leading to a series of costly engagements that eroded Japan's experienced pilot base even further. The industrial race that Yamamoto had feared accelerated dramatically. American shipyards operating at full capacity launched the Essex-class carrier, Yorktown named to honor her predecessor, lost at Midway in January 1943, followed by sister ships at regular intervals. Light carriers, escort carriers, destroyers, submarines, and auxiliary vessels poured from American shipyards at rates Japanese planners had considered impossible. By mid-1943, the United States possessed more carriers in the Pacific than Japan had fielded during its entire opening offensive. Japanese shipyards, meanwhile, struggled to complete even the carriers already under construction. Hampered by material shortages, competing priorities, and Allied submarine interdiction of vital raw materials from Southeast Asia, aircraft production told a similar story. American factories delivered thousands of improved fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers, each generation incorporating lessons from combat experience. The Grumman Hellcat fighter, introduced in early 1943, outperformed the Zero in speed, climb rate, and durability, while matching it in maneuverability at combat speeds. The Curtiss Helldiver replaced the Dauntless as America's primary dive bomber, carrying larger bomb loads over greater distances. Japanese aircraft development, conversely, stagnated. The Zero remained Japan's frontline fighter, its initial advantages eroded by American tactical adaptations and improved American aircraft. Replacement models came slowly. Manufacturing quality declined as skilled workers were conscripted for combat duty and replaced with inexperienced labor, including schoolchildren. The pilot quality gap widened catastrophically. Japan's pre-war pilot training program had been rigorous to the point of being wasteful, eliminating candidates for minor deficiencies and producing a small number of superbly trained aviators, but the program's throughput was inadequate for wartime attrition. After Midway and Guadalcanal decimated the experienced pilot cadre, Japanese training programs shortened and standards dropped, attempting to produce quantity over quality. The results were predictable. By late 1943, Japanese pilot quality had declined precipitously, with new aviators often possessing minimal combat training before being thrown into battle against increasingly experienced American pilots flying superior aircraft. American pilot training, by contrast, expanded massively while maintaining high standards, producing thousands of well-trained aviators who gained combat experience before facing Japan's best remaining pilots. Strategic bombing further constrained Japan's war-making capacity. American submarines, operating from Pearl Harbor and Australian bases, launched an increasingly effective campaign against Japanese merchant shipping, sinking tankers carrying oil from the Dutch East Indies, freighters transporting raw materials from Southeast Asia, and supply ships supporting Japan's scattered garrisons. By 1944, Japan's merchant marine had been reduced to a fraction of its pre-war strength, and the home islands faced critical shortages of oil, steel, aluminum, and other materials essential for modern warfare. The magnificent aircraft carriers Japan struggled to build often sat pierside because insufficient fuel oil existed to operate them. The strategic consequences of Midway extended far beyond the immediate tactical defeat, cascading through Japan's entire war effort like fractures through overstressed steel. December 7, 1943, exactly 2 years after Pearl Harbor, found the United States Navy conducting Operation Galvanic, the invasion of Tarawa Atoll in the Gilbert Islands, marking the beginning of the Central Pacific offensive that would roll inexorably toward Japan itself. The fleet supporting this operation included 6 fleet carriers and 5 light carriers. More naval aviation strength than had existed in the entire world before 1941. The Japanese Navy, still possessing significant surface strength, could not contest this offensive because it lacked the carrier aviation to protect its battleships and cruisers from American air attack. The strategic flexibility that had characterized Japanese operations before Midway was gone, never to return. Individual veterans of Midway experienced dramatically different fates as the war progressed. Admiral Nagumo, haunted by his hesitation on June 4th and blamed by some officers for the disaster, was given secondary commands far from the main theaters. He eventually commanded Japanese forces on Saipan and committed suicide when American forces overran that island in July 1944, preferring death to capture. Admiral Yamamoto continued commanding the combined fleet until April 1943. When American cryptanalysts decrypted messages revealing his inspection tour of forward bases, Admiral Nimitz, remembering Pearl Harbor and Midway, personally authorized the assassination mission. American P-38 Lightning fighters intercepted Yamamoto's aircraft over Bougainville and shot it down, killing the architect of both Pearl Harbor and the Midway operation. Japan lost not merely an admiral, but its most strategic naval thinker. American commanders fared better. Admiral Nimitz remained Pacific Fleet commander throughout the war, overseeing the island-hopping campaign that systematically reduced Japan's defensive perimeter. Admiral Raymond Spruance, who had commanded the Enterprise and Hornet carrier groups at Midway, went on to command the Fifth Fleet, leading operations from Tarawa through Iwo Jima and Okinawa. His cautious, methodical approach, so different from Admiral William Halsey's aggressive style, proved ideal for large-scale amphibious operations requiring precise coordination between naval, air, and ground forces. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, whose decision to continue searching and whose spotting of the Japanese destroyer had led Enterprise's dive bombers to the enemy carriers, received the Navy Cross and promotion. Serving throughout the war, the ordinary sailors and airmen who fought at Midway experienced the war's remaining years with the burden of survival. Ensign George Gay, Torpedo Squadron 8's sole survivor, was rescued after 30 hours in the water and returned to combat duty, eventually becoming an instructor, teaching new pilots the tactics that had cost his squadron mates their lives. Japanese survivors faced different challenges: isolated assignments, official silence about Midway, the knowledge that they had witnessed the turning point in a war their nation would ultimately lose. Many carried survivors' guilt, wondering why they had lived when so many comrades died. Questioning whether different decisions might have changed the outcome, post-war analysis by historians, strategists, and the participants themselves has identified multiple factors contributing to the Japanese defeat at Midway. American cryptanalysis and intelligence preparation gave Nimitz decisive advantages. Japanese plan complexity, with forces divided between multiple objectives, violated concentration of force principles. Operational security failures allowed American codebreakers to predict Japanese movements. Tactical decisions, particularly Nagumo's rearming choices, created vulnerabilities at critical moments. But perhaps most fundamentally, Midway exposed the limits of Japan's strategy, attempting to force a negotiated peace through a series of devastating blows before American industrial power could be fully mobilized. That strategy required consistent Japanese victories and American demoralization. Midway broke the pattern of Japanese victory, emboldened American resolve, and came at precisely the moment when American industrial mobilization was accelerating. After Midway, time became Japan's enemy in a way that no amount of fighting spirit could overcome. The Battle of Midway's place in history extends. Beyond its immediate military consequences, it demonstrated that intelligence, preparation, and tactical skill could overcome material inferiority. The Americans fought with fewer carriers and initially with inferior aircraft, but won through superior intelligence and tactical execution. It proved that overconfidence and assumption of enemy incompetence constituted fatal strategic flaws. It showed that industrial capacity, while not immediately decisive, became overwhelming when given time to mobilize. Most fundamentally, it illustrated that wars are not won by single battles, but by the strategic flexibility, resource management, and national will to continue fighting after setbacks. Japan won the tactical victories at Pearl Harbor and across the Pacific in 1942, but lost the strategic initiative at Midway and never recovered it. American forces lost tactical engagements throughout 1942, but maintained strategic coherence, learned from defeats, and ultimately prevailed. Today, the waters off Midway Atoll are a maritime grave. Protecting the remains of Yorktown, the 4 Japanese carriers, and thousands of men who fought there. The tiny island itself, now a wildlife refuge, shows few signs of the desperate battle fought overhead 83 years ago. But Midway's legacy endures in strategic studies, military academies, and historical memory as the moment when Japan's confidence was indeed shattered, when the seemingly invincible were shown to be mortal, and when the Pacific War's ultimate outcome, though requiring 3 more years of terrible fighting to achieve, became effectively determined by 3 minutes of dive bombers falling from the sky onto unsuspecting carriers. The empire that had stretched across the Pacific with such confidence in June 1942 began its long contraction that same day. Its fleet ripped to pieces, and its destiny irreversibly altered by the battle that Japan's leaders tried so desperately to conceal but could never escape.